First time I talked about what was really wrong with the Trump foreign policy, I think some of you were here, but I don't know how many. Next time, which I think is in November 21st, I think it is, we'll be talking about American grand strategy and where we are in terms of American grand strategy. But I really thought it was important to include what seems like a domestic policy subject, like immigration. Because the line between foreign policy and domestic policy in a great power like the United States is blurry, right? Everything affects everything else. Domestic policy and domestic politics affect foreign policy, sometimes pretty dramatically. And what's going on in the world, for example, in this case, the mass movement of peoples around the world in a way that we haven't seen probably ever, and certainly not since the late 19th century, clearly affects domestic politics. As Michael said, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, and not just in the United States and Europe. There are other places too, where the mass movement of peoples, enabled by new technology to some extent, but also engined by all sorts of very deep cultural and sociological and economic phenomenon. Probably when the history of this time that we're living in is written, this phenomenon of mass migration and all the various political and social effects that it is having will probably rank on a par with the technological tsunami of which it is a part and in which we are experiencing, and all the other seemingly large issues that loom over us, like proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and all kinds of other subjects. I bet you, I won't be around to know in 50 years, I'm sure, but I bet you that migration, mass movement of peoples, will be right up there, number 1 or 2, that define the area we're living in. So I want to talk about immigration in a number of ways today in order to knit this fabric between what is domestic and what is foreign, and show you that how seamless and how porous these categories actually are. I want to talk in general terms about immigration in the United States, and then I want to get very granular. I want to give some examples of how the issue kind of rolls down into local politics. I wish I knew how much you understood or how much you followed this subject. My experience in Singapore so far and at RSIS is that faculty and students are real sharp and very well informed about a whole range of issues. And I underestimate your background knowledge at my peril, all right? But on this particular issue, I find it really hard to see how especially non-U.S. nationals could have granular knowledge of this subject, because one of the reasons is it is so complicated, it is so capacious, it exists in so many forms, and the American mainstream press itself fails adequately to cover this issue, especially when it distills its way down into the lives of everyday people at local levels. So even Americans don't understand this very well because the press is lacking. I find it very difficult to see how anybody 9,600 miles away could really have a handle on this, but I could be proved wrong. So let me now go back and start with some very basic things about this issue. The United States, probably more than any other nation on the earth today and maybe in history, is defined by immigration. Not to say anything disparaging about Native Americans, who have not had a very nice shake from American history, but the United States is an immigrant country. There are only a few countries that are like this. Australia is another, Canada, adjunct to the United States, North America. There aren't many countries like this, and the kind of nationalism, according to the sociologists and the political scientists, the kind of nationalism that exists in the United States is different as a result of that from most nationalisms in most places in the world. If you read the literature on this, the distinction is usually between civic nationalism and ethno-linguistic nationalism, blood and soil nationalism. Nationalisms that, the more abstract concept of a nation, that is really an extrusion of clan or tribe or sort of extended biological family. A civic form of nationalism, although one should not underestimate the hearth culture dimension of civic nationalisms, certainly not in the United States. And if you want, by the way, just if you, parenthetically, if you want to read, if you have time and you want to read a really excellent book about the hearth cultures that made up the United States at its earliest, in its inception. There's a wonderful book by a guy named David Hackett Fisher called Albion's Seed. It's a very thick book, but it's a wonderful book. So if you really want to know about the origins of the United States and why American politics works the way it does, on a deep sociological level, that's a very good book to read. But America was made by immigration. And America was made great by immigration. All right? The great diversity and strengths of the society come from its diversity. The slogan of the country is E pluribus unum, right, in Latin, from many one. And the United States prides itself on being an immigrant nation, a nation, potentially the first universal nation, a nation born in the womb of the Enlightenment, the possessor and advocate of the liberal principles of the Enlightenment, the universal sort of proto-humanist principles of the Enlightenment. We like being an immigrant nation. That's who we are, right? And it is very ironic and sad to me that we now have in the Oval Office a man whose slogan, "Make America Great Again," right, is 180 degrees out from and opposite from what in fact has made America great. Because President Trump's attitude toward immigration is, to put it mildly, negative. It's negative even toward legal immigration, let alone the great swarm of issues that loom around illegal immigration. And I'll get to these matters in a minute. There are two general points I want to make before I get into the granularities. One is that immigration does not sit alone as an issue in the United States and its history any more than it does in Europe today. It sits within a nest of other social factors that determine how immigration at any given point in history is seen. And what you see in American history are a series of sine waves, essentially, that run through the country's history even before 1776, before independence. And basically it goes like this. Newcomers show up. And the newcomers are not exactly like the people who are already there. All right? Now, David Hackett Fisher, I mentioned, he defines 3 or 4 hearth cultures. And although here in Asia, you may think that all of the immigration from Great Britain to the American colonies before 1776 was more or less homogeneous. All right? They all spoke English. They all came from the United Kingdom, what became the Great Britain at the time. Not true. Not true. The particularities of local dialect and mazeways in Great Britain were quite varied. And people came from various specific places in Britain to various specific places in the United States and formed different hearth cultures based in part on different religious traditions. So, for example, in New England, as I think you all know, the Puritans came. The Puritans were a Calvinist branch, as opposed to the Anglican Lutheran branch, of what was then a still very young Protestant Reformation. Quakers came to the Mid-Atlantic area. Scots-Irish types came to the Piedmont region, the more southern regions of the United States. And then when the United States expanded toward the Pacific westward, these various hearth cultures in very intricate patterns made their way from east to west, through the Ohio Valley, across the Mississippi River and into the west, and all the way to Hawaii. In the meantime, other groups came and wove themselves into the demographic and spatial characteristics of the developing nation. So it's quite complicated to separate it all. But the point is, there were different hearth cultures, even before there were large numbers of immigrants who came to the United States for whom English was not the native language. So what you've seen is a kind of layering of immigration patterns over the entire spatial area of North America and the United States. And every time new people showed up, the old-timers, even if they were only there 15 or 20 years before, right, would go, tisk, tisk, who are these strangers, all right? So there's always been a reaction, a nativist reaction against new immigration. But the new immigrants, with pretty much no exception, managed to find their way into the American creed, to buy into the civic nationalism, the principles of the civic nationalism, and do quite well. I mean, basically, people who've come to the United States have almost never been, well, I mean, be careful here. They have those who have been economic aspirants in particular, as opposed to refugees from persecution and bigotry. they have almost never been the bottom of the societies from which they came. They have always been unusually ambitious people, sometimes people who had less reason to want to hang around the old country than others. And by and large, this self-selected group of people have done pretty well in the United States. So they assimilate, they do well, they pull their weight, they pay their taxes, they build their societies, and they sort of merge after a while, and the original discomfort about the newcomers goes away. And this goes back a long way into American history. Even Benjamin Franklin, all right, the sainted founding father, the elder founding father of the American Republic, even Benjamin Franklin complained bitterly when German-speaking immigrants came to Pennsylvania. And this was in 1853, before the Revolution. So this irritation, this nativist reaction, even from Benjamin Franklin of all people, this courses through American history again like a sine wave. And I don't want to go through the history itself. We'd be here until next Tuesday if I did that. But just to give you a couple of markers about how this has worked. After the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, a lot of Irish Catholics came to the United States. And the founding of the United States was mainly Protestant. There was one exception, and that was the state of Maryland. The Ark and the Dove was a Catholic grant from Lord Baltimore. But all the other of the original 13 colonies were stridently Protestant in their attitude, though not the same. In fact, let me just tell you this story. I don't want to run out of time. I'll tell you this story. My daughter and I, we were in Boston a year or so ago, and my daughter is an adult. She has 3 daughters of her own now, but we're walking around downtown Boston on what was called the Freedom Trail. It's like a little, where tourists can just go and sort of see the old architecture and the history of Boston. And she noticed that there were 2 burial grounds within about 100 meters of each other, okay? And they were both founded in the year 1630, 1631. And so it dawned on her, all right, to ask me the question, why are there 2 separate burial grounds so close to one another? What was that about? And I said, okay, it's a good question. Let's look at the bigger one, all right? Look at the names, all right? John Hancock is there. Samuel Adams, people who signed the Declaration of Independence are there, all right? Some of the great founding fathers from New England. They were all Puritans or from Puritan background. They were all Calvinists, right? And that was their burial, that was their church property, and that was their burial ground. At King's Chapel, just down the road, was a smaller burial ground, okay? And if you looked at the names on the tombstones dating back to the 18th century, what you find is that these were Anglicans. These were Church of England people. Why were they there? Because the Calvinists got a little out of hand in New England from time to time. For example, in 1693, they burned a lot of women or hanged a lot of women who they claimed were witches. And they actually believed in what they called spectral evidence to prove the existence of witchcraft. And the more, how shall I put it, the more cosmopolitan folks back in the metropole in London thought these people were nuts and needed to be controlled better. So they sent more Anglicans from London to govern the colony in a more, what they considered to be civilized and rational way. And all of those people, the families and the names of people who are buried in King's Chapel, they are the first citizens of Canada. They were the Tories who fled the United States during the time of the Revolution. So I was able to show my daughter, just from looking at these 2 burial grounds, a little bit of the early history of the United States. So these hearth cultures and these religious traditions in the United States around the time of the Revolution were by no means homogeneous, okay? So, but when you get German speakers and then God knows who coming in, you can see. Now, so we have when the Irish, back to the Irish, when the Irish came, they were Catholics, of course. And this really irritated a lot of people. And a party arose in American history that was basically an anti-Catholic party. It's called the Know Nothing Party, okay? And those of you that know some American history, 19th century American history, will remember this. I don't know how many of you know any of this stuff. I'd be shocked if you did. Probably have better things to do. But even the Ku Klux Klan, and even, early 20th century emanations of these things, the 1924 restrictive immigration legislation, which changed, which really torqued American immigration history dramatically. All of these things were the result of influxes of newcomers who came so fast that people were concerned that they could not be assimilated properly or that they would be wrongly assimilated. There was a lot of nativism, depending on when you're talking about. A kind of Anglo-Saxon racism runs through all this. Sometimes it's normal. natural. It doesn't seem that way today, but it was then. There are examples also of anti-Asian behavior when the Chinese laborers and some Japanese laborers came to build the railroads out toward California. It also elicited a nativist reaction against these people. In California, and I think it was in 1907, legislation was passed prohibiting Chinese and Japanese immigrants from owning land, which caused riots in Japan at the time. But on the east coast of the United States, nobody was, most people never even seen an Asian, let alone cared one way or the other about them. But you have these reactions. Now, over time, of course, e pluribus unum, or the melting pot, pretty much wins out. The main exception, which cannot be compared to immigrants from Germany or from Japan and China or from Italy or from Eastern Europe, or from anywhere, the main exception in American history socially that runs through American history from the beginning is, of course, slavery, is, of course, blacks who were brought against their will to the New World. So this is a separate matter. Blacks in the United States, especially in more left-wing politics in the United States today, blacks tend to get lumped together as just another identity politics group, all right? Hyphenated Americans, African Americans, Italian Americans, whatever. This is wrong. This is really misleading, and it's analytically twisted. There is no analog in identity politics or in any other way to the situation of African Americans in the context of American history. So when it comes to this is the unusual immigration. It's not like the ones that I'm really talking about. So where are we now in terms of immigration? Well, there are some general differences between these sine waves of the past, where you had newcomers come, a reaction against them, political action taken that reflected the anxiety in the existence of society. There's some differences now. I'd say there are four main differences. The first is that the scale of the immigration that we have seen since the 1965, there was major immigration reform in the United States, a widening, a reopening. 1924 to 1965, it was very constricted. 1965, the doors were thrown wide open again, and the accumulated numbers of immigrants to the United States has gotten pretty sizable, and especially in recent years, last 15, 20 years, the end of the Cold War. It's partly because of technological ease of transportation and other reasons, communications, things like that. Something like 13.4% of the American population right now living in, are foreign-born. If you add first-generation Americans born to immigrant parents, the numbers are something like 43, 45 million people. It's the largest percentage of foreign-born people in the United States ever, with the possible exception of the numbers that had accumulated by around the 1880s and 1890s, as the United States bade immigration, especially from Europe, in order to fill the new factories of the expanded Industrial Revolution. But so that's one thing. It's just, these are just large numbers, and people have come relatively rapidly by historical standards. Second difference is that back in those days, pretty much everybody, not everybody, but pretty much everybody who came was European looking, okay? And their skin color was more or less the same skin color as the people who were there at the founding, right? That's not as true as it sounds, all right? Because we have this word that people use, white, right? Like, I am white, okay? But when my grandparents came to the United States in the 1880s, they were not white. They were Jews. Jews were not white. When the Irish came, when they were here in the 1850s, right, the native population did not consider Irish people white, although they were pretty fair. But you can imagine Italians coming from Sicily, a little darker, they were definitely not considered white. Now, of course Italians are white. Poles are white, right? Croatians are white. Jews are white. Everybody's white except black people. And don't forget, in the United States, the starkness of the skin color differences are pretty stark. It didn't like that in the Middle East, and it's not like that in Asia. It's very weird in the United States. You'd have to hang around in the United States for a couple of months to get the feel of this, right? But who was considered white changed over time, put it that way. So, but now we have people, a lot of people in the United States, who are clearly not white. They're all the complexions of the world, and that's a little different from the earlier immigration. They're also spread out in different places. Back in the day, back in the 1890s, around at that time, you had factories in industrializing in cities, in the East, Midwest, so forth. But most of the immigrants were urban. They were in these big cities. The pattern of immigration lately is very different from that, especially among Hispanic immigrants. They are all over the place, and they are in small towns, and they're everywhere. They used to be 25, 30 years ago pretty much in the Southwest and in Texas, and then up the Mississippi River, in Chicago, in St. Louis, Kansas City. That's no longer true. There are Hispanic communities now basically everywhere, or in Florida. Now they're basically everywhere. It's a little like the Polish plumber issue in England. And you have these really back places, Yorkshire, these sort of cozy little villages in England where typical citizen never saw a foreigner. So even a Polish, the archetypal Polish plumber shocks them. Somebody who speaks either no English or poor English or English with a Polish accent, they don't know what to make of that. Well, the same thing's true in the United States. I mean, in the so-called flyover America, people are pretty insular, always have been. It's a continental-sized country after all, right? And so when foreigners show up that they have no experience of, they definitely notice. When they show up in mass, a lot of people, start opening taco stands and playing music that the locals have never heard before, and start acting in public in certain ways that are traditionally considered by the resident population to be, quote, unseemly, all right, it rattles people. So that's different, all right. Another difference is that in the olden days, back in the 1890s, when the earlier period of very, very large and rapid immigration, the American creed was a very strong thing. Americans were very proud of themselves. Americans tend to be a little chauvinistic, and because they're insular, don't know any better. It's a little excessively proud, although not without some reason. I mean, being an open, Enlightenment, universal nation has its nice aspects. I rather like it, but after Watergate and the Vietnam War, self-criticism in the United States created a kind of a pall on self-image, and there was less pressure in the society in general for immigrants to fully integrate attitudinally into the society. And that's when you began to get hyphenated Americans. That's when you begin to get, this kind of American and that kind of American. If you go back and you look at the speeches of Theodore Roosevelt, for example, during the period of the first large-scale rapid immigration, he was resolutely opposed to the whole idea of a hyphenated American. Americans must be fully Americans, 100%. You have to leave the old world behind. Yeah, you have a nice recipe for lasagna? Great. But that doesn't make you an Italian-American. You're an American first, and forget about that old stuff, all right? And Israel Zangwill, who was a Jewish immigrant to the United States, wrote this play called The Melting Pot. That was the meme of that period. But in the 1980s and 1990s, and more recently, that has not been the feel. I mean, we don't teach civics in school very much anymore in the United States. There's a kind of guilt complex. I mean, sometimes the elites sound a little bit like Cotton Mather. This is an old tradition, the Jeremiah tradition of Puritanism in America, the self-flagellation, the mea culpa, we are sinful, that's why all these bad things happen. This is very much a part of the religious culture. And again, it goes in sine waves. And lately, though, we've been pretty down on ourselves about a lot. We feel guilty about pressing our values onto these folks. So it reduces the urgency in their minds of assimilating fully, not just to the economy, but to the whole value structure. And then some, well-meaning liberals thought it would be just marvelous to make the United States a bilingual Spanish-American culture. And so everything is bilingual. In the county where I live in Maryland, Montgomery County, everything is in Spanish and in English. And that was even true before there were all that many Spanish-speaking people in the area. And a lot of these, well-intended liberals thought they were doing everybody a big favor, but the Spanish immigrants thought it was a terrible idea because it reduced the urgency for them and for their kids to learn English, which they came to get ahead. And you don't get ahead speaking a foreign language. So they were kind of irritated by, the old phrase that the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. I personally like Saul Bellows' variation on that, which is that the road to hell is paved by the same contractor who paves all the other roads. You have to think about that one. But basically, you have, especially in eastern cities, you have these liberal control of these cities trying to be really nice to the Hispanics, and a lot of the Hispanics not particularly appreciating it. And the idea was that all of these people would be grateful to the liberals, to the Democrats, mainly, and they would turn around and vote for them. Well, that doesn't really happen to the same extent that people thought. First of all, Hispanic citizens, recent Hispanic citizens in the United States, don't vote very much. They don't vote. Their voter participation in the 2016 election was 7%. That's the lowest of any group in the United States. They just don't vote. We don't want to go into why, but a lot of them vote conservative because they are socially conservative people. And they don't like what they hear from the Democrats. So that didn't work out. It didn't work out for the Democrats in the United States any more than in 1997 when Tony Blair decided it would be a great idea to have a lot of third world immigrants to Britain. The idea being that they would be very grateful to the Labour Party and they would vote Labour. Well, they haven't necessarily voted Labour, and what the Labour Party got instead was Brexit and made Enoch Powell into a prophet. Not exactly what Tony Blair thought was going to happen back in 1997. But anyway, back to the United States. So all these factors are different from before. And on top of it all, if you listen to the demographers, and people in the United States know this now, that I think the crossing lines are 2040 or 2030, something like that, not too far away, that if the demography continues the way that it is, so-called white Americans will become a minority. And the country will be made up of a majority of minorities who are non-white. Okay? All right, this freaks a lot of people out. It just bothers people. They feel like they're being displaced or replaced. And there are far-right lunatic conspiracy theories, replacement theory. I mean, the people who showed up the summer before last in Charlottesville rallying around a Nazi flag, they all knew this stuff. And this is lunatic right-wing conspiracy theories. I mean, they particularly, around the Nazi flag, were arguing, Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Well, you know, let's do a little math here, okay? How many Americans are there? About 330 million Americans, right? How many Jews are in the United States? There are roughly as many Jews in the United States as there are citizens of Singapore in Singapore. About 5.8 million, something like it. It's less than 2%, right? How 2% are going, how 5.8 million people are going to replace 330 million people? That's really a trick, isn't it? But they don't know these numbers. They don't believe the numbers if you tell them the numbers. And the same thing is true of all the other minorities, ethnic minorities that they're afraid of. Now, populism that feeds on this kind of anxiety, this kind of fear, it's the last general point I want to make, is not uniformly spread throughout American society. David Goodhart, who used to edit Prospect magazine, a friend of mine, wrote a book recently, got a lot of attention, in which he called attention to the difference between the some places and the somewheres and the anywheres. The divisions within societies between sort of like the average person and elites, which breaks down often, though not entirely always, between rural and urban populations. In urban populations these days, knowledge economy types, people who are plugged into the global economic systems, these are the anywheres. These people can be anywhere. And their loyalty are to other jet-set, globalized elites anywhere in the world, and they have more in common with those people than they do with their own citizens in many respects. They're differently and highly educated people. Their lifestyles, I hate that word, but you know, their lifestyles are far more opulent. And the elites in Western countries, certainly in the United States, are all pulled from this urban sector pretty much. The political elites, business elites, media elites, and they have become disconnected from the majority of people. And they don't really understand how the average person lives anymore. And part of the anger that you see in the polarization in American society, which breaks down pretty neatly along the urban-rural. If you look at the electoral map, for example, at the 2016 election or the midterm elections, and you plot the rural-urban, really in a granular way, you see how tightly this aligns. So you have these divides along these lines between the somewheres and the some places and the anywhere types. And the immigration debate clearly breaks down exactly along those kinds of lines. So cosmopolitan types in big cities, you know, they love multiculturalism and they love the whole talk, you know, the whole liberal talk. As far as they're concerned, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States now, you know, epitomized by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who want open borders. In other words, let anybody come to the United States who feels like it. You can get here and you're not a felon or you're not, you know, got tuberculosis, whatever. Open borders, right? That kind of an idea to the average, sort of the average American and so-called flyover, just a normal American, I mean, they think of that as insane, and that they just want to accelerate the replacement of the, of the original body politic, and they feel it as a sense of existential threat, corporate existential threat, and genuine crisis. And that is one of the reasons why I predicted years ago, and I stand by it, that we are in for a lot more political violence in the United States. We've seen some, right? We're going to see a lot more, I think. Because this is not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not the cause of this. He's a symptom of it. He is a subsequent accelerant of it, but his election is a symptom of this polarization and this anxiety, which goes down to these questions of existential identity. And it's the nature of this new immigration, this recent immigration, and the way that it differs from large immigrations of the previous periods that has teed this up. Now, the last general thing I want to say is, as I mentioned before, immigration fits into a nest of other social factors. And what's been happening in the United States over the past, I would say, 30-some years has included a pretty dramatic hemorrhaging of social trust or social capital. And I'm going to assume that you know what I mean when I say that. What I'm really talking about, I don't want to talk about this too much, but beneath every political order, there is a society that, for the most part, governs itself. There are informal rules of authority within society generated over many, many, many years that lead people of similar backgrounds and similar sort of occupational statuses to have a sense of mutual reciprocal obligations of what the other people around them are going to do. And this is nice for most people. It's like a nest. It reduces the cognitive load on a daily basis when you can have a sense of calm expectations about the forces acknowledged to be loose in the social world. When you introduce a whole lot of people who don't share those mutual expectations, it makes people it puts them on guard. It makes it raises their cognitive load. I refer to this as social poetry. James C. Scott, who's a political scientist at Yale, refers to this through what he calls his anarchist squint as the local vernacular, local social vernacular. These things matter to people, and it goes back to Edmund Burke's description of the small platoons of social life. And basically, what it comes down to is that the more that a society is self-governing with informal rules of expectation and behavior, and even something as seemingly simple as etiquette is actually a whole lot more important than you might think, because etiquette are a series of rules that allow people who are different from one another to assess the intentions of others and to act in such a way that people do not presume each other to be mortal enemies. Etiquette actually has a much more important social function than most people realize. I'm not just talking about table manners, I'm talking about the whole range of what we mean by etiquette. People like this sense of security in their local areas. And then what happens, inevitably, as technology changes and people move around and labor profiles change, is you get what my late colleague Peter Berker used to refer to as pluralization. Right? Movement, modernity, implies pluralization. When you move from, Ferdinand Tani called it from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. I assume you know these terms. I hope you know these terms. When that happens, people get pluralized, and they see for the first time that there are others in the world who may be just as wealthy or just as happy or just as vibrant a society as they, who think totally different about all the stuff that they thought there was only one way to think about God and about gender and about family. These people think differently about that. They eat different, they dance different, they do all these things different, but they're okay. So that then shows people a mirror, all right, for them for the first time to really look into their own ways of doing things and say, well, where did this come from, right? That whole process of pluralization, right, is very destabilizing, at least at first. All of 19th century European literature is about this. I mean, that's what Dickens is about. You have these people coming from the country, or women trying to make inappropriate marriages, classes being all scattered together. That's what happens when you have these periods of creative destruction, as Schumpeter put it, with all this technological churn and social churn that results from it. So Americans right now are feeling a lot of insecurity. A lot of things are just different, and people that have, that like the stabilities of community life, small town life, or even for that matter, neighborhood life in large cities, they don't know which way is up. They don't know what the future is going to bring. If you add to that demographic and economics uncertainties, like, for example, the 2007-2008, what we call the Great Recession, And Singapore, it's called the, what's it called, the Global Economic something. We don't, we Americans don't care what you call it. We call it the Great Recession, right? So this makes people nervous. But I have counted 7 different categories of erosion in social trust in the United States from 7 different places. And I want to just list them. I'm not going to be on time to discuss them. I want to just list them for you. And I want to do this because I want to show you that immigration, which is ordinarily not, it's always neuralgic in one way or another for some people. But it doesn't reach crisis levels as a political issue, as a third rail like it is now, unless other things are destabilized about the society. And I would argue that not all of these factors, but many of them also are they're the same, but with variations in Europe. So here are the 7 sort of contextual disruptions in American society, some of which have taken decades to develop, that provide the reason why immigration has become such a hot button political issue. So first, overall, we've already talked about this in brief, the American population is more heterogeneous now than it was before. This has been a gradual thing, but every once in a while there'll be an iconic event that will it'll dawn on people about how heterogeneous. I mean, I'll just give you an example. Not long ago, beginning of the month, well, middle of the month, we have a holiday in the United States called Columbus Day. All right? You've heard of that. You guys know all that. I'm telling you stuff you already know, aren't I? You know everything I've said. This is a waste of your time. I'm sorry. But I'll keep going anyway. In the last couple of years, it's no longer just Columbus Day, which is really what it comes down to. It's Italian American Day. Why Italian Americans deserve their own day, I don't know. The Irish have St. Patrick's Day, But so it's just the way, it's like kind of ethnic ecumenicism in American culture. It's kind of, it's not Hello Kitty or anything that cute, but it's still quaint. It's how we do these things. They kind of pay homage to the various flows of human beings into the great cultural, the great cultural richness of American diversity. But now some people want to call it not just Columbus Day, they want to call it Indigenous Peoples Day. Okay? Because obviously Columbus comes to the New World and indigenous peoples are affected pretty dramatically by it. So you see, now you have a political polarization and forms of identity politics invading what had been a completely innocuous holiday. Actually a very stupid holiday, to be perfectly honest. I have proposed getting rid of Columbus Day altogether, not just because it's becoming divisive, and who needs another point for divisiveness, right? But because we have a problem in the United States, an argument over so-called early voting. Okay, Republicans basically want to limit early voting to not at all, and Democrats want to have early voting a year before as long before the election as possible. And the argument is, working class people can't get away from their jobs as readily, can't get transportation to the polls to vote. So it's unfair to the Democrats not to have early. That's the argument, right? Well, if you make election day, midterm elections and the presidential elections once every 4 years and 2 years, if you make them into national holidays, right, then you don't have to worry about this early voting problem. Anybody who wants to get to the polls can get to the polls. Well, how do you do that? You're going to add basically, 1.5 holidays a year. What would that? 1.25, whatever it is. You're going to add. So you have to take something away. So what I would do is I would take Veterans Day, which is November 11th. November 11th, Veterans Day in the United States is for veterans of World War I, because the armistice was on November 11th, 1918. Right? I mean, I hate to clue these people, but there are no more living veterans of World War I. All right? Combine Veterans Day with Memorial Day, make it a combined homage to the armed forces, and get rid of Veterans Day, get rid of Columbus Day, and make Election Day a national holiday. Simple solution, right? Well, the simplest solutions are impossible in the United States right now because the political class is brain dead. But that's neither here nor there. So that's the first thing. We have a more heterogeneous population, and you can see the emanations of it in silly stuff like Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. Second, the country is no longer Protestant in the way that it was for basically the entire history of the country. And I mean mainline Protestant. I mean the Protestant religious sensibilities that were those of the founders. Now, only 46% of the American population nowadays self-identifies as Protestant Christian, but that's really not, that's misleading, because evangelicals make up a lot of that number, and evangelicals are not traditional Protestant Christians. They are neo-fundamentalist Christians. a lot of what evangelicals in the United States believe derive from the doctrine of someone named John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, which is a middle 19th century phenomenon. This idea of the rapture, the stuff you've heard about, this is not traditional Christianity. It certainly isn't traditional Catholicism, right? So they like to call it, they like to characterize what they do as the old-time religion, but it ain't the old-time religion. The number of mainline Protestants that actually accord with the theology and the social mores of the founders is about 16%. And that's all in the United States. And basically, the urban elites are highly secular, and they're even anti-religious in most respects in the United States. That's another part of the cleavage between the rural-urban divide. More rural peoples are still traditionally pious and religious, and when you say that a behavior is unseemly, that's the word in English, they know what you mean, right? That kind of word used in East Coast and West Coast cities will usually get you a smirk, all right? That's a big cultural divide. And you can see this is epitomized by the fact that the Supreme Court nowadays, for the first time ever, over the past, I think it's been about the last 5 or 6 years, the Supreme Court in the United States has no Protestants. There's not a single one. They're all Catholics and Jews. And I think they're all Catholics and Jews, nominally. I mean, that's just an iconic example of how this has changed. Third thing is social isolation. This comes from a totally different place. But there was more class segregation in American society today than there was 30 or 40 years ago. People just don't know people from other classes. And that's a phenomenon of technology, largely. The insularity we see now in the United States, the physical face-to-face insularity, is partly a function of technology. So we have, it used to be if you wanted to put gas in your car, somebody would come out and they'd pump gas into your car. Now you have automatic pumps in the United States. You had to go to the bank, right? Well, there'd be a teller. Now you don't have a teller. Now there are ATMs, right? Used to be you go into the city for some reason. And now you don't have to go into the city. You have ring roads. We have ring roads around our central urban areas, which has created, by the way, nutritional deserts for a lot of the people who live in these cities. So there's less face-to-face contact now between classes in the United States. And with these technology things now, the iPhones, things like that, even among younger generational cohorts, you can use these phones to create more face-to-face interaction, but you can also use it to isolate yourself pretty seriously. So we have acquired social autism among American youth. I mean, they're really good with video games and stuff, but if they have to go and talk face-to-face, for example, to a college admissions officer, they don't know how. And frankly, I worry about, it's even worse here. I walk around this campus and I see about 98% of all the undergraduates and graduate students on this campus, they are neurobiologically addicted to their goddamn phones. All right? They are reshaping their brains, and they don't even realize it. And it really worries me. And they are becoming socially autistic because of these damn phones and self-isolating. I stop the sermon there. Now, next, we have in the United States institutional decay. Our institution, one of the reasons that people don't trust each other, why social capital has eroded, is because the main institutions of the society are not functioning the way that they're supposed to. They're not delivering the goods, right? There's a long series of reasons why that is, but you see, it rolls on itself. People don't trust the elites because the institutions over which they preside don't work, okay? So when the elites say, oh, don't worry about immigration, all right? Or they say, I'll give you an example of how this works. Donald Trump, in his inaugural address, talked about carnage, about all the Mexicans, both the legal ones and the illegal ones, that was the word he used in his inaugural, causing carnage all along the southern border of the United States. This is a bunch of bullshit. Legal immigrants in the United States actually have a lower crime rate than typical Americans. And by the way, I forgot to mention, there are cases where Americans like to think of Mexicans as immigrants, but there's a case in the southwestern United States and in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, where it wasn't the immigrants that came to the United States, it was the United States that came to the so-called immigrants. It was called the Mexican War. They were there first, but never mind. So this institutional decay accentuates the anxiety over immigration because most Americans now have lost hope that the government can manage or solve the problem. So it's a runaway problem, right? It isn't something that people expect will eventually be dealt with. It's just runaway. So that's another part of the anxiety associated with the issue. 5, again, from a totally different province of social life in America, we have something that George Gerbner, who was at the Annenberg School, called the mean world syndrome. You know what that? Have you ever heard of the mean world syndrome? Well, he did Professor Gerbner did research showing that Americans who watch a lot of commercial television, Hollywood movies, have a very strange idea of the actual amount, the actual number of incidents of murder and violence and pederasty and rape and so forth in American society. Everybody knows that fiction shows on TV and the movies accentuate this stuff because it raises the shock bar. And that's what people have gotten used to, an ever-raised shock bar. To get your attention, you know, in mass entertainment culture, the script writer and the actors have got to hit you right between the eyes with a brick to get your attention. So it just keeps going up and up. But people, you would think, people who, even people who watch a lot of this stuff, can still tell the difference between fiction and reality, right? Not right. That's not what the data show. The data show that, in fact, it's blurred. And if you are watching, I mean, TV sets are different now in technology, but if you spend 5 or 6 hours a day watching a 24,000 volt ray tube, which is what an oscilloscope is, aimed at your head in a darkened room, and your brain waves go into beta, you are not bringing to bear your critical facilities on what you're seeing, and your capacity to really distinguish between the fiction on the screen and the world around you gets a little murky. And so there's a lot of evidence that people who watch a lot of TV and mass fair violent and salacious entertainment believe that more of this stuff is actually out there in the world real than is the case. So there's this ambient fear created by the nature of American mass entertainment media. 6, whether you like it or not, there's a lot of evidence that unstable families, a lot of divorce, a lot of single parenting creates emotionally insecure children. And emotionally insecure children grow into emotionally insecure adults. People have difficulty forming bonds with others, have difficulty trusting others. If you as a child are betrayed by the people who are supposed to love you and take care of you, it's very difficult, in many cases, for that person to trust any form of authority, whether it's familial or social or political. And we have in the United States, it's actually gotten better over the past 12 to 14 years, but the number of broken families, the number of kids living with single parents or in foster homes is quite high by historical standards. And that's part of the ambient angst in American society. That's part of the ambient fear. And again, the whole immigration thing sits in that nest. Remember the stuff at the southern border where the Trump administration's policies separated children from their families for reasons I'll get into if I have time. Well, that just, I mean, those are different things, right? But the human brain is promiscuously associational. So the sight of that at the southern border sort of like just sends sparks in all of these people in the United States who were traumatized as children from the wages, the burdens of broken families. And last, and this is a little bit tricky, if you have these platoons, these small platoons of social life, and they self-organize so that you can have a relatively light hand, and they're flat hierarchically in society, you can have a relatively light-handed government. I mean, Burke said that, you know, there must be order in society, and if it doesn't come from within the society, then it must be imposed from without by the government, okay? So the more integral and coherent a society is, the more informal rules take care of business, so to speak, in keeping the place, keeping a social order functional, then the less that government has to do. But if you start breaking down the society, if the society hemorrhages social trust, if there's so much churn and so much change that people become, they reach their wits' end, that they don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, then there's a demand for government to come and fix it, whatever it is. When the economy grows to a certain scale, and you don't have small shopkeeper capitalism anymore, and you have repeated market failures and rentier behavior on the part of elites, like we have in the United States in the healthcare sector, in the education sector, in the housing sector, and I could go on. When you have this kind of rentier behavior, there's always a demand for the government to step in and fix it somehow. But the larger the government gets and the larger the administrative state becomes, the more it undermines the social fabric of those informal linkages that create social order underneath of the political system in the first place. So nanny government and the excesses of the administrative state, and by the way, the United States has a large state, but not a strong state. You should never confuse those two things. Germany, for example, has a pretty large state, but it's a strong state. Singapore has for its size, has a fairly large state, but it's a strong state. It's efficient, it gets things done. Not in the United States, for reasons we don't have time to go into. We have a large state, but not a strong state. And one of the results of that is government continues to want to, there's a demand for government to fix things, do things, but then the government tries to fix things and do things, and it doesn't always do such a hot job of fixing things. So there's a Navy SEAL slogan that my friend David Brooks added onto for Fun and Profit. And the slogan is, whatever's worth doing is worth doing badly. No, I got it wrong. Whatever's worth doing is worth overdoing, and David Brooks added, and a great expense. And that's a good definition of the impulses behind the expansion of the administrative state in the United States. Whatever's worth doing is worth overdoing, and a great expense. All 7 of these sort of nesting phenomena in the United States, all of them together and in their own complicated ways that I don't understand, sort of shines the light on the polarization over immigration, and makes it all worse. In a way, immigration is not just a third wheel, it's like a lightning rod, in a way, that speaks to all of these reasons for the hemorrhage of social trust. It takes on the baggage of all of these elements or aspects of social change and erosion in American culture. And again, it's not just the United States. You can mark a lot of the same things in many European countries, not just in European countries. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about some specific things. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm not. But I just want to mention them. And I will say as follows. I brought with me a bunch of cards. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me and wants to know more about the subject, just send me an email. And I also brought copies of what I call the Immigration Talk bibliography. Now, the first thing on the bibliography is the mention of a man named David Stoll, teaches at Middlebury College in Vermont. And if you want to really understand like the granular policy, like the so-called crisis at the southern border, if you want to understand why there hasn't been comprehensive immigration reform, if you want to understand how remittances work in all this, if you want to understand how recent political changes in places like Honduras, for example, have effect, he's the guy to go to. He knows more about this than anybody. But the other things that are listed on the sheet are things that I've written over the past couple of years. Some on very directly granular aspects of the immigration policy debate, and others that are more general and are more about what I just have been telling you about. Let me just very briefly mention a couple of the granularities. Number one, the problem at the southern border is actually a problem. It's not the result of any single piece of legislation. It's the result of a series of incremental changes and reactions to those changes. But it really is kind of a mess. It was not just a mess during the Trump administration, it was a mess before too. The Obama administration deported more illegal aliens than the Trump administration has. So basically this is how it works. If you show up physically, if you're from Central America and you show up on the southern border of the United States, until just a couple of weeks ago really, some executive orders have changed things, especially if you had a kid with you, somebody under the age of 18, right? You have to be led across the border. That's the law. You have to be led across the border. And if you say, I am seeking asylum, in other words, I'm not an economic migrant, I am seeking asylum, you are entitled to a hearing from an immigration judge, okay? There are lots of places to cross the border. You can cross the border at El Paso, which is a big city, right? Or you can cross the border at some cactus in the middle of freaking nowhere, okay? So what's been happening is that professional caravans of smugglers have gotten in the business of organizing immigrants from Central America, mostly from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, not from Nicaragua, not from Costa Rica, not from anywhere else, just those three countries. And some of it turns on political events that have taken place. For example, about 9 months ago, there was an election in Honduras in which the center-right candidate won. In order to embarrass him, in order to screw up a relationship with the United States, the leftist party organized caravans of large numbers of people, and they knew where to cross. They crossed at points in the border where there were only 3 or 4 border guards. They simply overwhelmed them. There was no way they could stop them. And so they had to take them to places and try to, put them up in like little miniature sort of camps until their immigration hearing and then they could talk to the judge, right? But what do? They don't stay in these camps. They just get lost. They just leave. They just go into wherever they want to in the country. Many of them have relatives already in the country, either as illegals or as green card holders, right? And so they just disappear. And there is simply no way for ICE, which is part of the Homeland Security Department, to track or find these people. I don't know why. I mean, FedEx can find a package anywhere on the planet, including Antarctica. We don't put stickers, barcodes on human beings when they come across the border, right? But it's evidently extremely hard to find these people. There are also cities in the United States where there are basically, pro-immigration and even pro-illegal immigration left-wing governments that are called sanctuary cities. And the federal government spent $27 billion in fiscal year 2017 giving money to urban areas that are sanctuary cities to protect people from the consequences of their having broken federal law by crossing the border illegally. So American immigration policy is completely incoherent. One arm of it does exactly the opposite of what the other arm of it is supposed to do. That's just an illustration of how screwed up and how polarized and how totally incoherent the policy actually is. So what the Trump administration tried to do, what the Obama administration before tried to do, with a different body language, was to find a way to deter this kind of thing. Because this was a deliberate strategy of basically swarming the border and getting people across. So one of the things they did, which got really bad press, was separating the children from the parents. All right? Because if you bring a kid with you, it's ollie ollie in free, right? But they thought, well, if they separate the children from the parents, then they can deter this, right? And by the way, sometimes the children aren't even the children of the families that are bringing. They're borrowed, all right? You can actually go to a family and say, I want to borrow your kid, all right? They're not really related, but you just make up a name. You get to the border, you say it's your kid, it's not your kid, and then later on, once the kid gets in, he tells them their real name, and then his parents can come too. That kind of thing is what they do. This is what happens. So this is a strategy, and it's not a bunch of individuals showing up at the border. It's a strategy. It's a family strategy to get into the United States, because it's just a richer country, and the welfare benefits are terrific if you can't happen to make it with a job. That's what people do. Now, to some extent, the media in the United States is complicit in this. If you read any article by Caitlin Dickerson, who writes for the New York Times, any article she's written for the past 3 or 4 years, she will talk about the motives for people coming from Central America. And by the way, a lot of the people who come from Central America they have Spanish-speaking border guards, bilingual border guards in the United States. But come to find out that a lot of the people who arrive don't speak Spanish as their first language. They're indigenous peoples from Central America. They speak Quechua. They don't even speak Spanish. And they're illiterate in their own language. So trying to deal with these people, American border guards who speak Spanish and English, it's not easy to deal with these people who don't speak Spanish very well, let alone English. No English. She will always tell you, when she describes this in general, that people fleeing violence and gang-related intimidation and sexual harassment, that this is all, she always lists this number one in the reasons people come. So basically she's saying that all the asylum stories that are told, that basically they're true stories. But that's not what the International and Organization of Migration says. The IOM, which is very, it's very pro-migration, the IOM, they do very, very meticulous data studies, and they show that it's just the reverse. In Central America, the last year we have data, I think it's 2017, only 6.5% of the immigrants from Central America really have come from violent areas. And again, if you read David Stoll goes to Guatemala every summer. He's been there for like 9 or 10 years. He talks to people. He understands it, right? Most of the people who come are economic aspirants, and they are trying very hard to figure out a strategy that'll work. But if you read the New York Times, you get the impression that 95% of them are all genuine asylum seekers, and it's just not true. So, now, there's a big difference, in other words, between asylum and economic migrants. But because it's blurred, and because it's very difficult to tell, and because we don't have nearly enough judges to actually go through these cases, it's just chaos at the southern border. So what the Trump administration has tried to do, and the Obama administration before it, is try to find ways to deter this. We can't handle it, so try to find a way to deter it. But because Trump is himself such a bigot, and so the body language is also noxious, okay, what is really a fairly pragmatic effort to do something about this has turned into a really toxic issue, with everybody accusing the president of being, a bigot and a racist, which he is. But that doesn't fix the problem. right? It just polarizes. It makes any kind of solution even more difficult. One more issue. It's a personal thing. Zoning. Zoning is another place that this kind of stuff shows up. So I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, right near the District of Columbia. So Montgomery County is a pretty large county. It includes lots of different areas, some of which are very opulent. I don't live, of course, in the very opulent sections of the county, and some of which are not so opulent. Okay, so there's been a lot of Hispanic migration into the area. It really started back during the Civil War in El Salvador, which the United States inserted itself in, whether wisely or not, I don't know. But a lot of Salvadorians, and then Hondurans, and Guatemalans, and Mexicans, of course, others came, and whole sections of Montgomery County are basically Hispanic, and all the signs are in Spanish, and everybody speaks Spanish. And most of these people have green cards, and most of them are my neighbors. They're very good neighbors. They take care of their kids and their properties and their pets, and they're great people, you know, and they work hard, no problem. Just like all previous generations of immigrants, types of immigrants all throughout American history. But there is a lot of illegal immigration. A lot of illegals live in the area. And recently, one of the members of the local county board, there are 8 or 9 county commissioners, they promulgated an idea to relax the rules about building what are called ADUs, additional dwelling units, in residential neighborhoods on residential property. In other words, if you want to create a grandmother apartment or a mother-in-law apartment above your garage, or if you have a large enough lot, a freestanding apartment on your property, right? There were restrictions for that, like zoning in any civilized place. There are zoning restrictions. Well, this guy introduced a resolution to relax them, and the reason he wanted to relax them was because he thought, well, if you're a property owner, you should be able to do anything with your property that you want to. You want to build a mother-in-law apartment, go right ahead. You know, as long as you know, if you're going to have more people living there, you need to create more off-street parking. All these things you have to do to make it okay, right? And a lot of people thought it would increase the amount of affordable housing in the area, and there are a lot of people who are, you know, not too rich, and they need affordable housing, and that was one way to do it, as in addition to building high rises, things like that. So there were some people who were for it, but most of the old-time residents who had experienced this kind of thing, they were against it, because they said it's going to lead to greater densification. It's going to lead to havens for more illegal aliens to come in. They're going to break zoning rules, like, for example, no group houses. If you in the residential zoning in Montgomery County, you can't live in a group house unless you're related to one another. That's the neighborhoods say that's just not. We don't want that. And you're going to have a lot more people renting rather than owning their own homes, and that's not good for them, and so on and so forth. And you're going to overcrowd the school, and basically there's going to be more litter, there's going to be more noise, you're going to crash the property values, that's going to reduce the tax base for education, and so you got all these new people coming in, it's going to be densified, the schools are going to be more crowded, right, as the tax base to fund the schools is going to, and so a lot of people didn't like this idea, all right, and there was a huge fight over it, all right, and the mainstream media, the local media in Washington, did not cover the story at all. They really didn't care about it. This goes on not just in the Washington area. This goes on in every major city in the United States, where there's an unusual number of immigrants, Spanish-speaking people in the D.C. area, but it's really quite broad spread. This almost never gets any coverage. But zoning issues like this, how neighborhoods actually are, okay? I'll give you some more examples. In Montgomery, the police department was actually given an order by the county council, not explicit, just, you know, by the way, to treat different parts of the county differently in legal terms. So, for example, let's say you own a panel truck and you're a plumber or you're a handyman, okay? You can bring your panel truck, your beat-up panel truck, home if you live in Wheaton, where I live, or if you live in Connecticut Avenue Estates, or if you live in Aspen Hill, these little neighborhoods in Montgomery. You could bring your vehicle home and you could park it on the street. You could even park it on your frickin' front yard, which is technically illegal to park up on the grass. You can do it and no cop will bother you, and no county official will bother you. And you can rent your property for a group home, including people who don't have legal residency rights, and no county official will come and knock on the door. And if a county official comes and knocks on the door and you say, oh, we're really all cousins, it's okay, the county official will go, yeah, sure, fine, and just leave, all right? In other words, they don't enforce the law. If you try to bring a panel truck home from your work vehicle with your company name emblazoned on the door, and you try to park it in Bethesda or you try to park it in Potomac, right, you'll be arrested. That car will be towed away, all right? And I could give you more examples of the same sort of thing. In other words, there are two laws in Montgomery County. There's one law for the wealthy, affluent parts of the county, and there's a different law for the less affluent parts of the county that are being trashed and densified by all of this illegal immigration and all of this restrictions on the zoning. Now, if you live, like I do, in one of the places where there's basically a second law, why wouldn't you be irritated? You're paying the same taxes, same tax rate, same property taxes, but there are two different legal standards, right? And the one that you are living under is not as nice as the one that these other guys. Why wouldn't that piss you off? Pisses me off. But the people of Montgomery County, and by the way, all 8 or 9 of the members of the county council, not one of them actually lives in one of these poor areas. Not one of them sends their kid to any school in that area. Not one of them is a Republican or a conservative. And whose fault is that? Not the members of the county council, the electorate, which refuses to throw these bums out and fix the problem. So, in a democracy, people get the government they deserve. Some people suffer from it, but that's their problem. They want to get off their ass and do something about it, then they have to live with the results. So, it's not the immigrants that people are mad at, it's a little irritating, but it's not the immigrants, it's the politicians people are mad, because they're totally disconnected from how ordinary people live their lives. And they don't care about crashing property values in overcrowded schools, because it's not their property values and it's not their schools. Right? I mean, I wish Charles Dickens was still alive to write about this, because he could do a hell of a job. Now, last thing I want to do is read you 2 poems. I want to read you 2 poems, and then I promise I will shut up. The Statue of Liberty, okay? The New Colossus. A lot of people have heard just a couple lines from this poem. It's not a long poem, but almost nobody's ever heard the whole poem, and that goes for Americans too. It's a beautiful poem. It was written in 1883, and let me just tell you, I'll give away the punchline now. The poem was written in 1883 by Emma Lazarus, who was a Sephardi Jew. The May Laws, promulgated by Alexander III, came in 1881. And this was a time when huge numbers of Jews were trying to escape anti-Semitic pogroms in Tsarist Russia. A lot of them came to North America. And Emma Lazarus was clearly writing this poem about her brethren who were seeking asylum in the United States. She was not writing about economic migrants, okay? But here's what happened. She writes this poem in 1883. The Statue of Liberty was erected on its current, where it is now, Liberty Island, only in June of 1885, 2 years later. The plaque that bears the poem, The New Colossus, wasn't put at the foot of the statue until 1901, by which time, because of other immigration, Italian immigration mainly, there was a conflation of the categories of understanding between political asylum and economic aspirants. It got fuzzed over. And Emma Lazarus could not do anything about the repurposing and the misunderstanding of her original poem, because she died in 1887 at the age of 38. Here is The New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows world-wide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, she cries with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So, now let me read another poem, also very short. Emma, perhaps it's for the best you never knew what the fickle tides of time did to you. Your sonnet so fair in Jacob's behest, to a small share of balm and a moment's rest on American shores,
in the new world's womb, far from czarist hatreds that did loom. Your beauty lives on, all the same, for at liberty's feet is written your name. Its beacon, rest assured, o'er the sea still glows, though your first purpose, alas, few will ever know.